My name is Sophia Martinez. I'm 24, and 3 months ago I received a text from my mother that would destroy everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. We changed all the locks. You don't have a home anymore. Let's see how you survive without us now. Those 20 words didn't just lock me out of a house. They revealed a betrayal so deep, so calculated, that it would take me weeks to uncover the full extent of what my own family had orchestrated behind my back. Hey everyone, before we dive into this wild family drama that honestly sounds like it came straight from the darkest corners of Reddit, I want to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you're ready for a story about family betrayal, sweet revenge, and justice finally being served, smash that like button and hit subscribe because this tale of karma is going to blow your mind. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for the ending that nobody saw coming. To understand how devastating that text was, you need to know what my relationship with my family looked like before everything imploded. I was what you'd call the golden child, straight-A student, full scholarship to Northwestern, graduated summa cum laude with a degree in finance. My parents, Maria and Carlos Martinez, had immigrated from El Salvador with nothing but dreams and determination. They worked 3 jobs between them to give me and my younger brother Diego every opportunity they never had. For 24 years, I was their pride and joy. Every family gathering, every church event, every neighborhood barbecue, I was the daughter they'd parade around, talking about my achievements, my promising career at Goldman Sachs, my bright future. Mira a nuestra Sofia, my mother would beam, she's going to take care of us when we're old. That phrase haunted me later because it revealed so much about their expectations and the transactional nature of what I thought was unconditional love. My relationship with Diego was more complicated. 3 years younger, he'd struggled academically, bounced between jobs, and had what my parents euphemistically called phases, periods where he'd disappear for weeks, come back broke and defensive, with stories that never quite added up. But he was charming in that way that chronic underachievers often are, always with a joke to deflect serious conversations, always with a new plan that would change everything. My parents enabled him constantly, making excuses, covering his rent, bailing him out of whatever mess he'd gotten himself into. I thought it was just typical family dynamics, the responsible older sibling, the wayward younger one. I never resented taking care of everyone. When I got my signing bonus from Goldman Sachs, I immediately sent my parents $10,000 to help with their mortgage. When Diego needed money for what he claimed was a certification program, I covered it without question. When my parents' car broke down, I arranged for repairs and a rental. I was the family's financial safety net, and I wore that responsibility like a badge of honor. The warning signs were there, but I was too blinded by love and duty to see them. Family dinners where conversations would stop abruptly when I entered the room. Hushed phone calls that ended the moment I appeared. Diego's sudden ability to afford expensive clothes and electronics, despite his sporadic employment. My parents' growing questions about my salary, my savings, my investment portfolio, questions that felt less like parental interest and more like reconnaissance missions. The first real crack in my perfect family facade came 6 months before the text. I'd come home unexpectedly to my apartment to find Diego there with 2 guys I'd never seen before. They were sitting at my kitchen table with what looked suspiciously like bank statements and credit card offers spread out in front of them. When I asked what was going on, Diego laughed it off, said they were helping him apply for loans to start a business. The strangers left quickly, and Diego was unusually chatty and affectionate afterward, which should have been another red flag. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I checked my credit report. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started paying more attention to my mail, my online accounts, the little details of my financial life that I'd previously managed on autopilot. Nothing seemed amiss, but the seed of doubt had been planted. 2 months later, I got a call from American Express asking to verify some recent applications. Applications I'd never made. Applications that had been submitted from my parents' address, with my information but phone numbers I didn't recognize. When I explained that these were fraudulent, the representative was sympathetic but matter-of-fact, This happens more often than you'd think, especially with family members. You'll need to file a police report and dispute everything formally. That phone call was my first real glimpse into what had been happening behind my back, but I still couldn't believe my family was involved. I convinced myself it was just identity theft, that somehow my information had been stolen and misused by strangers. The alternative, that the people I loved most in the world were systematically destroying my financial life, was simply too devastating to consider. But the evidence kept mounting. Calls from collection agencies about debts I'd never incurred. Credit cards arriving at addresses I'd never lived at. Loan applications for amounts that made my stomach turn. Each discovery felt like a physical blow, and each time I tried to talk to my family about it, their responses became more defensive, more evasive, more obviously rehearsed. The breaking point came when I decided to surprise my parents with a visit on a Tuesday afternoon. I used my key to let myself into their house, a key I'd had since I was 16, a symbol of my permanent place in their lives. What I found there would haunt me for months: my personal documents spread across the dining room table, my social security card, copies of my birth certificate, bank statements that I'd never given them access to, and my brother Diego explaining to my parents how to forge my signature more convincingly. The moment I stepped into that dining room and saw my entire identity laid out like pieces of a puzzle they were assembling, time seemed to stop. My birth certificate, social security card, copies of bank statements I'd never shared with them, credit applications with my forged signature, it was all there, organized with a precision that spoke to months of planning. "What the hell is this?" I whispered, and the three of them jumped like they'd been electrocuted. My mother recovered first, her face cycling through shock, guilt, and finally settling on defiance. "Sophia, mi amor, you're home early. We were just..." "You were just what?" "Stealing my identity? Destroying my credit? Planning to ruin my entire financial future." My voice was getting louder with each word, months of suppressed suspicions finally erupting into raw fury. Diego stood up from the table, and for the first time in years, he looked genuinely ashamed. But it was my father's expression that broke my heart, not shame, not guilt, but anger. Anger that I'd caught them, anger that their carefully laid plans were falling apart. "You have so much, Sophia," he said, his voice cold in a way I'd never heard before. "More money than you know what to do with. We raised you, we sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay us? By being selfish." The word hit me like a slap. Selfish. After years of being their safety net, their source of pride, their retirement plan, I was selfish for not wanting them to commit identity theft. "I've given you thousands of dollars," I shouted. "Every time you needed help, every time Diego screwed up, every time there was an emergency, I was there. How is that selfish?" My mother stepped forward, her hands reaching for me in that familiar gesture of comfort that had soothed me through skinned knees and broken hearts. But now it felt manipulative, calculated. "Mija, you don't understand. The money you gave us, it wasn't enough. Diego has debts, serious debts. People are looking for him." The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. Diego's mysterious disappearances, the strangers in my apartment, his sudden defensiveness about his business ventures. My baby brother, the charming screw-up, had gotten involved with something dangerous, and rather than face the consequences, they decided to sacrifice me to save him. "What kind of debts?" I demanded, turning to Diego. "What did you do?" He couldn't meet my eyes. "It started small, just some gambling. But then I met these guys who said they could help me make it back, you know? All I had to do was help them with some financial stuff, identity verification for loans and credit cards. Easy money." "Identity theft," I corrected. "You're talking about identity theft." "Not theft," my father interjected. "Family. We're family, Sophia. What's yours is ours, what's ours is yours. That's how family works." I stared at him, this man who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd worked double shifts to pay for my school clothes, who'd cried at my college graduation. "Family doesn't destroy each other, Papa. Family doesn't forge signatures and open credit cards in each other's names." "We were going to pay it back," Diego said quietly. "All of it. Once I got back on my feet, once the business took off." "With what money?" I was laughing now, but it was the kind of laughter that comes from complete disbelief. You can't hold a job for more than 6 months, Diego. You've never paid back a single loan in your life. And now you owe money to dangerous people, so your solution is to destroy my credit and make it my problem. My mother's mask finally slipped completely. We gave you everything, she hissed. Everything we had, everything we were, we poured into you. And now that we need you, you're going to abandon us? You're going to let your brother get hurt because you're worried about some numbers on a piece of paper. Some numbers on a piece of paper. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Those numbers determine whether I can buy a house, get a car loan, qualify for a mortgage. Those numbers are my financial future, and you've been systematically destroying them for months. I started gathering my documents from the table, my hands shaking with adrenaline and heartbreak. Driver's license applications I'd never filled out, apartment rental agreements for places I'd never lived, loan documents with signatures that looked like mine but felt foreign under my fingertips. How much? I asked quietly. How much do you owe these people? The silence stretched for so long I thought they wouldn't answer. Finally, Diego whispered, $47,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $47,000. More than most people made in a year, more than I'd ever given them in total, despite years of generous gifts and emergency funds. And how much have you stolen from me? I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. More silence. Finally, my father cleared his throat. The applications haven't all gone through yet. Maybe 12,000 so far, but you were planning for more. It wasn't a question. The evidence was right there on the table. Applications for credit lines totaling over $60,000, all in my name, all with their contact information. I looked around the dining room where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, where I'd done homework while my mother cooked dinner, where I'd announced my acceptance to Northwestern and my job offer from Goldman Sachs. This room that had been the center of so many happy memories was now the scene of the most devastating betrayal I could imagine. I'm calling the police, I said quietly. The reaction was immediate and explosive. My mother started crying. My father started shouting about ungrateful children and family loyalty, and Diego just stood there looking lost and scared, finally understanding that his actions had consequences that extended beyond himself. But I was done. Done with being their safety net, done with enabling Diego's irresponsibility, done with sacrificing my future for their poor choices. I pulled out my phone and started dialing. That's when my mother said something that would haunt me for months. If you call the police on your own family, don't bother coming back. You'll have no home here, no family here. We'll change the locks, and you'll be dead to us. I looked at her, this woman who'd sung me lullabies and taught me to cook tamales, and realized that the mother I'd loved and trusted had been a carefully constructed facade. The real Maria Martinez was someone who would sacrifice her daughter's future without hesitation to protect her son's bad choices. Then I guess I better find a new family, I said, and walked out of that house for what I thought might be the last time. The 3 weeks following that confrontation were the loneliest of my life. True to their word, my parents changed the locks. I discovered this when I went back 2 days later, hoping that cooler heads had prevailed, that maybe we could find a way to work through this disaster together. Instead, I found my key no longer worked and a note taped to the door in my mother's handwriting. Sophia, your belongings are in boxes on the back porch. Don't contact us until you're ready to apologize to your family. My belongings. 24 years of life, reduced to 6 cardboard boxes sitting on the covered porch like unwanted donations. Photo albums from childhood vacations, my high school graduation cap, the stuffed elephant I'd slept with until I was 12, books I'd annotated in college, jewelry my grandmother had given me before she passed. All of it packed away like evidence of a life they wanted to erase. I loaded those boxes into my Honda Civic and drove back to my apartment in Chicago, crying so hard I had to pull over twice. The physical act of moving my childhood memories felt like attending my own funeral. These weren't just objects, they were proof that I'd once belonged somewhere, that I'd been loved unconditionally, that I'd had a place in the world that felt permanent and safe. But the emotional devastation was nothing compared to the financial nightmare I was about to discover. I spent the following days methodically going through every aspect of my financial life, and what I found was worse than I'd imagined in my darkest moments. The credit cards were just the beginning. Diego and my parents had been busy. They'd applied for personal loans using my information, opened store credit accounts at major retailers, even attempted to secure a car loan in my name. Most applications had been rejected due to the sheer volume of requests, but enough had gone through to damage my credit score significantly. My previously pristine 780 credit rating had plummeted to 623 in a matter of months. But the most devastating discovery came when I tried to log into my student loan account to make my monthly payment. The account had been modified to show my parents' address as my residence, and someone had applied for additional graduate school loans in my name. Loans for a master's program at a university I'd never heard of, in a state I'd never lived in, for amounts that made my stomach turn. The total damage was staggering, over $30,000 in fraudulent debt, not counting the potential future harm from the applications that were still pending. My identity had been so thoroughly compromised that I was going to need to file police reports, dispute every fraudulent account, potentially freeze my credit for years, and prove to institution after institution that I was the victim of a crime committed by my own family. I made the call to the police on a gray Thursday morning, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. The officer who took my report was professional, but clearly uncomfortable with the family dynamics involved. "Ma'am, I have to ask, are you sure you want to press charges? Once we file this report, there's no taking it back. Your family members could face serious criminal penalties." I thought about Diego, who'd always been irresponsible but never malicious. I thought about my parents, who'd sacrificed so much to give me opportunities they'd never had. I thought about family dinners and birthday celebrations and the way my mother used to braid my hair before school. Then I thought about the $47,000 Diego owed to dangerous people, money that would somehow become my responsibility if I didn't take action. I thought about my destroyed credit, my compromised future, the cold calculation it had taken for them to systematically steal my identity over months. "I'm sure," I told the officer. "File the report." The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and legal consultations. I hired a credit repair attorney who specialized in identity theft cases, and her first question was one that would echo in my mind for months. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay?" Family members who commit identity theft often escalate to other forms of harassment when their victims fight back. I assured her I was fine, that my family wasn't violent, that this was just about money and poor judgment. But her warning planted a seed of anxiety that would prove to be justified in ways I couldn't imagine. The harassment started subtly. Phone calls to my office claiming to be from collection agencies, but with details that only my family would know. Anonymous emails to my work address with attachments containing embarrassing childhood photos and threats to share interesting information about my character with my colleagues. Text messages from numbers I didn't recognize, but with inside jokes and references that only Diego would make. Then my family went nuclear with their retaliation. They created fake social media accounts and began posting in local Chicago community groups, warning people about the ungrateful daughter who had destroyed her family over money. They shared details about my salary, my address, my workplace, painting me as a greedy, selfish person who had abandoned her immigrant parents in their time of need. The posts were crafted with the same precision they'd used to steal my identity, just enough truth mixed with emotional manipulation to be believable. They described my parents as heartbroken immigrants who had sacrificed everything for an ungrateful daughter who repaid their love by having them arrested. They painted Diego as a troubled young man whose mistakes were being punished with excessive cruelty by his vindictive sister. The comments on these posts were brutal. Strangers who knew nothing about the situation beyond my family's carefully crafted narrative called me heartless, selfish, a disgrace to my culture. Someone found my LinkedIn profile and began messaging my connections with warnings about my character. Another person called my office pretending to be a concerned community member with information about an employee's criminal behavior toward their elderly parents. I was being subjected to a systematic campaign of character assassination, and the most devastating part was that it was working. Friends who'd known me for years began asking uncomfortable questions. Colleagues started treating me differently. My landlord received an anonymous letter claiming I was involved in credit fraud and might be a flight risk. The final straw came when I discovered that my family had expanded their operation beyond just stealing my identity. They'd been monitoring my social media accounts, tracking my location through family members who were still in contact with me, and building detailed profiles of my daily routines, my friends, my habits. They knew where I shopped, where I worked out, which restaurants I frequented. They'd been watching me with the dedication of private investigators, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. That perfect moment came when I least expected it, and it would change everything about how I understood the people I'd once considered the most important parts of my life. The moment that would define the next phase of this nightmare began with what seemed like an olive branch. 3 weeks after the police report was filed, I received a text from my Aunt Carmen, my mother's younger sister who had always been the peacemaker in our family. "Mija, can we meet for coffee? I think I can help fix this situation with your parents. You know, I've been sharing this story with you all, and I keep thinking about how family dynamics can be so much more complicated than they appear on the surface. If you're still with me through this wild ride, I have to ask, have you ever been in a situation where someone you trusted completely turned out to be playing a much longer game than you realized?" The comments on these family drama videos always remind me that I'm not alone in this experience, and honestly, that connection means everything when you're going through something this isolating. Carmen had always been different from my mother, softer, less judgmental, more willing to see multiple sides of a situation. She'd been at my college graduation, crying proudly in the audience. She'd sent me care packages during finals week and remembered my birthday every year with thoughtful gifts that showed she actually listened when I talked about my interests and dreams. When we met at a small cafe in Lincoln Park, she looked genuinely distressed. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she kept twisting her wedding ring, a nervous habit I remembered from childhood family gatherings when tensions ran high. "Sophia, mi amor, this whole situation is tearing the family apart," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "Your mother hasn't been sleeping. Your father looks like he's aged 10 years, and Diego is scared out of his mind." I felt that familiar tug of guilt, the one that had controlled my decisions for my entire adult life. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe there was a way to resolve this that didn't involve destroying my family completely. "Tia Carmen, I know this is hard, but they stole my identity. They were planning to ruin my credit to pay off Diego's gambling debts. I can't just pretend that didn't happen." She nodded understandingly, reaching across the table to cover my hand with hers. "I know, baby. I know what they did was wrong. But I also know that your mother is terrified about what's going to happen to Diego if he can't pay back those people he owes money to. She's not thinking straight. So they decided to make it my problem instead? No, that's not. Look, I've been talking to them, and I think I've convinced them to come up with a payment plan. Your father is talking about taking out a second mortgage on the house, maybe selling the car. They want to make this right, but they need you to drop the criminal charges first." The request hung in the air between us like a trap I couldn't quite identify yet. Something about this conversation felt rehearsed, too convenient, but I wanted to believe in the possibility of reconciliation so badly that I ignored my instincts. "They want me to drop the charges before they make things right?" I asked. "That seems backwards. Why can't they start paying back what they stole, and then we'll discuss the legal issues?" Carmen's grip on my hand tightened slightly. "Because the charges are preventing them from getting the loans they need to fix this. No bank is going to lend money to people with pending identity theft charges. They're stuck in this impossible situation." She paused, seeming to gather her courage for what came next. "There's something else, Sophia. Something your parents didn't want you to know, but I think you have a right to understand what's really at stake here." My heart started racing. In family drama, there's always another layer, always a secret that recontextualizes everything you thought you understood. The people Diego owes money to, they're not just going after him anymore. They came to your parents' house last week. They know about you, about your job, about how much money you make. They think the family has resources they're hiding, and they're getting impatient. The cafe suddenly felt too hot, too crowded. The image of dangerous strangers showing up at my childhood home, threatening my parents because of my brother's stupidity, made me feel sick. What did they want? Payment, obviously. But when your parents explained that they didn't have the money, that their daughter was refusing to help the family, these guys got interested in you specifically. They asked questions, Sophia. Questions about where you work, where you live, what kind of car you drive. Fear crept up my spine like ice water. Are you saying they're threatening me now? I'm saying that if Diego doesn't come up with the money soon, they're going to start looking at alternative collection methods. And you've made yourself a very visible target with a very public salary working at one of the most prestigious financial firms in the city. The manipulation was expertly crafted. My family had created a scenario where I was the villain for refusing to be victimized, where my insistence on legal consequences for their crimes was actually endangering everyone. They'd found a way to make their problem my fault, and they were using my love for them as leverage to escape accountability. But even knowing I was being manipulated, the fear was real. If Diego really did owe money to dangerous people, and if those people really were expanding their interest to include me, then I was in danger whether I helped my family or not. What do you want me to do? I asked quietly. Come to dinner Sunday. Talk to your parents. See if you can find a way to work this out as a family before someone gets seriously hurt. I should have said no. Every instinct I had, every lesson I'd learned about boundaries and self-protection, was screaming at me to walk away. But the combination of fear, guilt, and desperate hope for reconciliation was stronger than my better judgment. Okay, I said. I'll come to dinner. Carmen smiled for the first time since we'd sat down, and something about that smile should have warned me. It was too bright, too relieved, too much like someone who'd just successfully completed a difficult task. Wonderful, Mija. Sunday at 6, just like old times. And Sophia? Maybe don't mention to your parents that I told you about the men who came to the house. They're embarrassed about the whole situation. I agreed, and we parted ways with a hug that felt almost normal. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to hope that maybe there was a way to salvage something from this wreckage, that maybe family really could overcome anything if everyone was willing to try. I spent the rest of the week planning what I would say, how I would balance accountability with compassion, how I could help my family without sacrificing my own future. I even went shopping for ingredients to make my mother's favorite dessert, tres leches cake, thinking that a peace offering might help smooth the path toward reconciliation. Sunday evening, I drove to my parents' house with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. I had no idea I was walking directly into the most elaborate setup my family had ever constructed, or that the dinner invitation was actually the first move in a game I didn't even know we were playing. I parked in the driveway of the house where I'd grown up, carrying my homemade cake like a white flag, and walked up to the front door that had been locked against me for weeks. When my mother opened it, her smile was warm and welcoming and absolutely perfect. Too perfect. The moment I stepped through the front door of my childhood home, I knew something was wrong. It was too clean, too organized, like a stage set designed to create a specific impression. The family photos that usually cluttered every surface had been carefully curated. Pictures of Diego's graduation, family vacations, holiday celebrations, but notably absent were any photos of me from the last 2 years. It was as if they'd systematically erased evidence of my adult success from their narrative. Mija, my mother exclaimed, embracing me with the kind of theatrical warmth that felt more like a performance than genuine emotion. I'm so happy you're here. We've missed you so much. My father appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Sophia, thank you for coming. I know this hasn't been easy for any of us. Diego emerged from the living room, and for the first time in weeks, he looked nervous rather than defiant. Hey sis. Thanks for giving us another chance. The whole scene felt rehearsed, like they'd practiced their lines and blocking before my arrival. But I was so desperate for normalcy, so hungry for evidence that my family still loved me, that I chose to interpret their awkwardness as genuine remorse rather than careful orchestration. Dinner was my mother's best effort, All my favorite dishes laid out on the good china we only used for special occasions. Mole poblano that had been simmering all day, fresh tortillas still warm from the comal, rice and beans seasoned exactly the way I remembered from childhood. The smell alone was enough to transport me back to simpler times when family meant safety and home meant unconditional acceptance. For the first hour, we stuck to safe topics. My job was going well, though demanding. Diego had been interviewing for positions in warehouse management. My parents were thinking about finally finishing the basement renovation they'd been planning for years. It was pleasant, normal, almost healing after weeks of conflict and estrangement. But I should have noticed that they were asking very specific questions about my work schedule, my daily routines, my weekend plans. Questions that seemed like family interest, but felt more like intelligence gathering when I reflected on them later. The conversation shifted when my mother brought out dessert. Not the tres leches cake I'd brought, which sat untouched on the counter, but Diego's favorite chocolate flan. That's when I realized this dinner wasn't about reconciliation at all. It was about something else entirely. "Sophia," my father began, his tone suddenly formal, "we need to discuss the situation we're all facing." "I thought that's what we were doing," I replied, but my stomach was already starting to knot with anticipation. "The police report," my mother said quietly. "It's causing problems we didn't anticipate." Diego leaned forward, his expression more serious than I'd seen it in years. "Soph, those guys I owe money to? They're not just angry about the debt anymore. They found out about the charges you filed, and they think we're trying to play games with them." "What do you mean?" "They think we have access to money, but we're hiding it by pretending to be broke," my father explained. "The identity theft charges make it look like we were desperate enough to steal from our own daughter, which means we really don't have resources. But then they see that you're refusing to help your family, and they think that means there's family money we're not admitting to." I set down my fork, my appetite completely gone. "So this is still about money?" "It's about survival," my mother said sharply. "These are not people who accept excuses, Sophia. They don't care about family dynamics or legal complications. They want their money, and they're running out of patience." That's when Diego dropped the bomb that revealed the true purpose of this dinner. "They want to meet you." The words hung in the air like a threat. "Excuse me. They want to sit down with you, talk about the family's financial situation, work out a payment arrangement that includes everyone." Diego's voice was carefully neutral, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "It would just be a conversation. You want me to meet with dangerous criminals to discuss paying off your gambling debts?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "We want you to help us resolve this before someone gets hurt," my father corrected. "These men are reasonable, business-minded. If they understand that the family has resources, but there was just a miscommunication about access, they'll work with us on a payment plan." I looked around the table at the three people I'd loved most in the world, trying to process what they were actually asking me to do. They wanted me to sit down with criminals, people who had threatened my family, and negotiate payment terms for debts I hadn't incurred using money I'd earned through my own hard work. And if I refuse? The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then things escalate. For all of us." "Are you threatening me?" "We're warning you," Diego said. "These guys know where you work, where you live. They know about your car, your routines, your friends. They've been watching, Sophia. If they can't get cooperation from the family, they'll find other ways to motivate payment." The room felt like it was spinning. My own family had not only stolen my identity and destroyed my credit, but they'd also provided dangerous criminals with detailed information about my life, my habits, my vulnerabilities. I was being stalked by people who wanted money I didn't owe them, and my family had painted the target on my back. "You gave them information about me," I said, the full scope of their betrayal finally becoming clear. "You told them where I work, where I live. You made me a target." "We were trying to buy time," my mother protested. "They were going to hurt Diego, and we panicked. We thought if they understood that the family had resources, they'd be more patient while we figured out a solution." "By throwing me under the bus." "By including you in the family's problems," my father corrected. "This is what families do, Sophia. We face challenges together." I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the tile floor with a screech that sounded like my last nerve finally snapping. Families don't commit identity theft. Families don't provide criminals with surveillance information about their children. Families don't set up their daughters to be extorted by dangerous people. Sit down, my mother said firmly. We're not finished talking. Yes, we are. I was already reaching for my purse, my keys, my jacket. I'm leaving, and I'm not coming back. If you walk out that door, Diego said, his voice cold and calculated, you're making this decision for all of us. These guys won't just forget about the debt because you're not willing to help family. They'll find other ways to get their money. I turned to look at him, this brother I'd protected and enabled for years, and saw a stranger. Someone who would sacrifice me without hesitation to save himself from the consequences of his own choices. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you started gambling with money you didn't have. That's when my mother played her final card. They're coming here tomorrow night, Sophia. 7 o'clock. They want to meet with the whole family to discuss payment arrangements. If you're not here, they're going to assume you're the problem that needs to be addressed. The threat was unmistakable. Show up and participate in negotiating payment for debts I didn't owe, or become a target for collection methods I didn't want to imagine. I looked at my parents, these people who had raised me, taught me right from wrong, instilled in me the values of honesty and hard work and family loyalty. The same people who were now trying to coerce me into meeting with criminals using threats against my safety. You really think I'm going to show up tomorrow and negotiate with dangerous people about paying Diego's gambling debts? We think you're going to do what's right for this family, my father said, his voice carrying a finality that chilled me to the bone. I walked to the front door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. What's right for this family would have been Diego taking responsibility for his choices instead of dragging everyone else down with him. What's right for this family would have been you supporting your daughter instead of sacrificing her to clean up your son's mess. I opened the door and stepped into the cool evening air, feeling like I was escaping from a prison I'd never realized I was in. Behind me, I could hear my mother crying and my father's angry voice, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. If I looked back at that house, at those people, I might lose my resolve and walk back into the trap they'd so carefully constructed. As I drove away, I realized that the family dinner hadn't been about reconciliation at all. It had been a recruitment meeting, an attempt to officially induct me into their criminal enterprise. They'd stolen my identity, destroyed my credit, provided criminals with my personal information, and now they wanted me to voluntarily participate in extortion schemes. The most devastating part wasn't even what they'd done. It was how well they knew me. They understood exactly which emotional buttons to push, exactly how to frame their requests to make me feel guilty for protecting myself, exactly how to make their problems seem like emergencies that required my immediate sacrifice. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd underestimated how much their betrayal had changed me, how thoroughly their actions had destroyed my blind faith in family loyalty. The Sophia who would have emptied her savings account to help them was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood that love without boundaries isn't love at all, it's manipulation. That night, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to my credit monitoring attorney, informing her that my family had escalated their harassment and that I needed additional legal protection. The second was to a private security consultant recommended by my company's HR department, someone who specialized in personal safety for executives dealing with extortion attempts. The third call was the one that would ultimately save my life. I called my cousin Marcus, my father's nephew who worked in federal law enforcement. Marcus and I had never been particularly close, but he was family in the way that mattered, someone who believed in justice over loyalty, accountability over blind support. Sophia? Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice concerned. Everything okay? It's pretty late. Marcus, I need help. And I think what I'm dealing with might be bigger than just family drama. I told him everything. The identity theft, the gambling debts, the mysterious creditors who were apparently dangerous enough to make my family panic, the dinner conversation that felt more like a recruitment pitch for criminal activity. Marcus listened without interrupting, his silence growing more ominous as the story progressed. Sophia, he said finally, the people your brother owes money to, did he ever mention names? Locations? Any details about how he got involved with them? Not really. Just that it started with gambling and evolved into something about identity verification for loans and credit cards. Identity verification. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Sophia, I think your brother might have gotten involved with something much more serious than gambling debts. What you're describing sounds like organized financial fraud, possibly connected to larger money laundering operations. The room seemed to tilt around me. What are you saying? I'm saying that if these people are as dangerous as your family claims, and if they're sophisticated enough to run surveillance on you, they're probably not just neighborhood loan sharks. They're likely part of a larger criminal organization, and your brother may have been helping them commit federal crimes. The implications hit me like a freight train. Diego hadn't just gotten in over his head with gambling debts. He'd become involved with serious criminals who used identity theft and financial fraud as part of larger illegal enterprises. And now they wanted to expand their operation to include me, someone with legitimate income and excellent credit who could be useful for larger, more sophisticated fraud schemes. Marcus, they want me to meet with them tomorrow night. At my parents' house. Absolutely not. His response was immediate and firm. Sophia, you're not going anywhere near that meeting. In fact, I think you need to disappear for a while until we can figure out exactly what we're dealing with. That's when I realized that my family's betrayal had inadvertently provided me with something invaluable, information about a criminal organization that law enforcement had probably been trying to identify and prosecute. Diego's desperate attempts to save himself had exposed an entire network of financial fraud, and I was now in a position to help bring them down. But first, I had to survive long enough to testify. The next morning, I woke up in a hotel room 30 miles outside the city, paid for with cash and registered under a false name Marcus had provided. My phone was turned off, my credit cards were in a secure deposit box, and I had enough cash to last several weeks without creating any electronic trail of my location. Marcus had moved quickly after our conversation, reaching out to contacts in financial crimes who confirmed my worst fears. The organization Diego had gotten involved with was indeed much larger than a simple gambling operation. They ran sophisticated identity theft rings that targeted families with high-earning members, using familial relationships to access legitimate financial credentials that could then be exploited for large-scale fraud. The pattern was always the same. Identify a vulnerable family member with financial problems, offer them easy money for simple tasks like identity verification, then gradually escalate their involvement until they were completely compromised. Once they had the victim thoroughly entangled in illegal activity, they would leverage family relationships to access higher-value targets, people with excellent credit, substantial incomes, and professional reputations that made them valuable for more sophisticated fraud schemes. Diego hadn't just been a gambling addict who'd gotten in over his head. He'd been recruited as an inside source for a criminal organization that specialized in exploiting family bonds for financial gain. And I had been their ultimate target from the very beginning. The meeting I'd refused to attend had never been about negotiating Diego's debts. It had been about recruiting me into their operation, using my family's manipulation and emotional coercion to make me voluntarily participate in criminal activity. Once I was compromised, they would have had access to my income, my credit, my professional reputation, and my connections in the financial industry. The scope of what they'd been planning was staggering. My legitimate job at Goldman Sachs would have provided them with insider information about financial procedures, client protocols, and security measures. My excellent credit would have allowed them to secure large loans and credit lines. My professional reputation would have given legitimacy to fraudulent financial transactions. But the most chilling revelation came when Marcus shared surveillance footage that federal agents had been collecting as part of a larger investigation. The dangerous criminals my family had described weren't just watching me. They'd been watching my family for months, documenting their financial struggles, mapping their relationship dynamics, and identifying me as a high-value target for recruitment. Diego's gambling debts were real, but they were also deliberately engineered. The organization had provided him with access to high-stakes gambling specifically to create the kind of financial pressure that would make him desperate enough to commit crimes for money. They'd studied our family dynamics and determined that I was the type of person who would sacrifice myself to protect people I loved. They'd been right about that up to a point. But they'd miscalculated how much betrayal I could absorb before my protective instincts shifted from my family to myself. The federal investigation had been ongoing for 2 years, tracking financial fraud patterns across multiple states. My family's identity theft scheme was small compared to the organization's larger operations, but it provided crucial evidence about their recruitment methods and operational procedures. Marcus arranged for me to meet with Agent Sarah Chin, a financial crime specialist who had been leading the investigation. We met in a secure federal building downtown, in a conference room that felt more like a bunker than an office. Ms. Martinez, Agent Chin began, I want you to understand that you're not in trouble. Based on the evidence we've reviewed, you're clearly a victim in this situation. But you're also potentially our best source of information about how this organization operates. She spread out photos and documents across the conference table, surveillance images of my family, financial records showing the scope of the fraud operation, organizational charts mapping the criminal network structure. Seeing my personal tragedy laid out as evidence in a federal investigation was surreal and devastating. The good news is that your family's involvement appears to be relatively minor and recent. Diego was being used as a low-level recruit, and your parents were unwitting accomplices who got caught up in his poor decisions. The bad news is that this organization doesn't typically allow people to simply walk away once they've been compromised. What does that mean for my safety? It means that the meeting they wanted you to attend last night was probably your last chance to cooperate voluntarily. When you didn't show up, you became a liability rather than an asset. Agent Chin pulled out a thick folder filled with financial documents. We've been tracking their operations across 7 states, but we've never had access to someone who is actively being recruited. Your cooperation could help us identify key players, understand their recruitment methods, and potentially prevent other families from being victimized the same way yours was. The weight of responsibility felt crushing. My family's betrayal had accidentally positioned me to help bring down a criminal organization, but it also meant I was now in serious danger from people who had already demonstrated they were willing to destroy lives for financial gain. What would cooperation look like? Controlled contact with your family to gather intelligence about the organization's operations. Recording conversations that could provide evidence of criminal activity. Potentially participating in surveillance operations to identify key players in the network. She paused, studying my expression carefully. But I need you to understand the risks. These people have already shown they're willing to commit identity theft, fraud, and intimidation. If they discover you're working with law enforcement, they could escalate to more serious crimes. I thought about my parents, who had sacrificed so much to give me opportunities they'd never had, now trapped in a criminal enterprise they probably didn't fully understand. I thought about Diego, whose poor choices had exposed our entire family to dangerous people who specialized in exploiting desperation. But mostly, I thought about all the other families who might be targeted by this organization, all the other daughters who might receive texts telling them they no longer had homes, all the other people who might have their identities stolen and their futures destroyed by criminals who understood exactly how to weaponize love and loyalty. What do you need me to do? Agent Chin smiled for the first time since we'd started talking. First, we need to get you properly protected. Then we need to figure out how to turn your family's betrayal into the evidence that brings these people to justice. That's when I realized that my story wasn't just about family drama or personal revenge. It was about something much larger, the way criminal organizations prey on love, loyalty, and financial desperation to destroy people from the inside out. My family hadn't just betrayed me, they'd been systematically manipulated into betraying me by people who understood exactly how to exploit family bonds for criminal gain. But now I had something they hadn't counted on, the truth, federal protection, and a chance to make sure no other family would go through what mine had experienced. The revenge I was about to get wouldn't just be personal. It would be justice served on behalf of everyone who had ever been victimized by people who turned love into a weapon. The next 6 months were the most intense period of my life, but also the most empowering. Working with federal agents, I became part of an operation that would ultimately bring down one of the largest family-targeting financial fraud rings in the country. But the personal justice I received was even sweeter than the federal convictions. The controlled contact with my family revealed the full scope of their manipulation. Wearing a wire during phone conversations with my parents, I discovered that they'd been coached by the criminal organization on exactly what to say to manipulate me into cooperation. The tearful apologies, the desperate pleas about family loyalty, even the specific threats about my safety, all of it had been scripted by people who understood how to exploit familial bonds for criminal purposes. Diego's involvement was deeper than anyone had realized. He wasn't just a victim of gambling addiction who'd gotten in over his head. He'd been actively recruiting other families in our community, targeting recent immigrants who had successful children in professional careers. The organization had identified our family as a perfect test case: hardworking parents with strong family values, a successful daughter with excellent credit and emotional attachment to family, and a son who could be easily compromised through gambling addiction. But the most devastating revelation came when we discovered that my family's betrayal hadn't been a desperate last resort. It had been planned for over a year. The mysterious men Diego claimed to owe money to had been monitoring me long before he'd accumulated any significant gambling debts. They'd studied my career trajectory, my income potential, my psychological profile, and had determined that I would be valuable enough to justify a long-term recruitment operation. My parents' sudden financial problems, Diego's escalating gambling, even Aunt Carmen's perfectly timed intervention, all of it had been orchestrated to create the exact emotional pressure that would make me vulnerable to manipulation. I hadn't just been betrayed by my family. I'd been the target of a sophisticated psychological operation designed to turn my love for them into a weapon against me. The federal case moved quickly once we had evidence of the organization's recruitment methods. Diego agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing details about the network's operations that led to arrests in multiple states. My parents, who had genuinely been manipulated rather than willing participants, received probation and community service after helping identify other families who had been targeted. But the personal justice came in ways I never could have anticipated. The criminal organization's systematic surveillance of my life had created a detailed record of my daily routines, my professional achievements, my financial responsibility, and my character. When their records were seized as evidence, they became part of the federal case file, official documentation of exactly how responsible, successful, and principled I was, even under extreme pressure. My credit report, which had been destroyed by my family's identity theft, was completely restored by court order. But more than that, the federal investigation created an official record of my victimization that actually enhanced my professional reputation. My employer, Goldman Sachs, was so impressed by my cooperation with federal law enforcement and my handling of an extremely difficult situation that I received a promotion and a substantial raise. The criminal organization had spent months documenting my daily life in an effort to find leverage against me, but their surveillance records actually proved that I was exactly who I claimed to be: a hardworking, honest, responsible person who had been systematically victimized by criminals who exploited family relationships. The most satisfying moment came during the sentencing hearing for the organization's leadership. As I read my victim impact statement, I looked directly at the man who had orchestrated the psychological manipulation of my family and said, "You thought you understood how to weaponize love and loyalty. You thought you could use my feelings for my family to make me a willing participant in criminal activity. But you made one crucial miscalculation. You assumed that love means accepting abuse, that loyalty means sacrificing yourself for other people's poor choices. You were wrong. Real love requires boundaries. Real loyalty means protecting yourself and the people you care about from destructive choices. You didn't destroy my family. You revealed which members of my family were worth fighting for and which ones were willing to sacrifice me to avoid consequences for their own actions." The lead defendant received 15 years in federal prison. Diego received 2 years, most of which was suspended due to his cooperation. My parents received probation, community service, and mandatory financial counseling. But the real justice came in the form of rebuilding. With my credit restored and my professional reputation enhanced, I was able to buy my own house. A beautiful place with a security system and guest rooms for the family members who had earned their way back into my life through genuine remorse and changed behavior. My relationship with my parents evolved slowly. They attended the financial counseling required by their probation and gradually began to understand how they'd been manipulated and how their choices had affected me. My mother, in particular, struggled with guilt about the role she'd played in my victimization, but our relationship eventually became stronger and more honest than it had ever been before. Diego and I had a more complicated reconciliation. His cooperation with federal law enforcement was genuine, and he served his sentence with the kind of serious reflection he'd never shown before. When he was released, he'd found work in construction and was attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings regularly. We're rebuilding our relationship slowly, with clear boundaries about financial support and family obligations. The most unexpected outcome was my relationship with Aunt Carmen, who turned out to have been another victim of the organization's manipulation rather than a willing participant in the setup. She genuinely believed she was helping negotiate a family reconciliation, not realizing that her approach had been scripted by people who understood exactly how to exploit her good intentions. Today, 3 years later, I have a family that's smaller but stronger. The people in my life have earned their place through actions rather than genetics, through respect rather than obligation, through love that doesn't require me to sacrifice my well-being for their comfort. I've also become an advocate for other families who've been targeted by similar organizations. The federal task force I worked with has used my case as a template for identifying and prosecuting family-targeting financial fraud rings across the country. We've prevented dozens of other families from experiencing the kind of systematic manipulation mine endured. The text message that started this entire nightmare, "We changed all the locks. You don't have a home anymore," turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to build a new definition of home, one based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than blind loyalty and emotional manipulation. My family had tried to make me homeless, but instead they'd freed me to create a real home for the first time in my life. They'd tried to destroy my future, but instead they'd helped me build a better one than I ever could have imagined. The karma they'd intended for me, isolation, financial ruin, professional destruction, came back to them in the form of criminal charges, public exposure, and the loss of the daughter they'd taken for granted for so many years. But it also came back to me in the form of justice, empowerment, and the kind of family relationships that are built on choice rather than obligation. Sometimes the best revenge isn't something you plan or execute. Sometimes it's simply refusing to accept treatment that you don't deserve and building a life that proves you were right to protect yourself. Looking back now, I realize that my family didn't just change the locks on their house that day. They unlocked something in me that I didn't know existed, the ability to choose love over loyalty, boundaries over obligation, and self-respect over family peace. And that might be the most valuable gift they ever gave me, even though they never intended it that way. So here's my question for all of you who've stayed with me through this incredible journey. Have you ever had a moment where someone's attempt to hurt you actually ended up being the catalyst for the best change in your life? Have you experienced that kind of cosmic justice where the universe seemed to step in and balance the scales in ways you never could have orchestrated yourself? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, because I've learned that we're never as alone in these experiences as we think we are. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama stories. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that it's okay to protect yourself from people who claim to love you but treat you like you're expendable. And remember, sometimes the family that locks you out is doing you the biggest favor of your life by forcing you to find the people who will never make you choose between love and self-respect. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and remember, karma might take its time, but it always finds its target. Sometimes justice looks different than we expect, but it's always sweeter when it comes with the knowledge that you protected yourself and others in the process. Take care of yourselves out there, and never forget that you deserve people in your life who would never dream of making you pay the price for their mistakes.